everyone, and welcome to the third episode of our podcast, Espresso with the Experts. Today, we have the honor to have my Espresso with Professor Michael Gerrard. Welcome, and thank you for being here with us today.
My pleasure.
So, Professor Michael Gerrard is the founder and the faculty director of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law. And he has been also the chair of the Columbia faculty for the Earth Institute. And he wrote several books. We are going to discuss them during the interview, so I'm not going to introduce them now. But now he's teaching at Columbia Law School, and he's teaching several classes on climate change, environmental regulation, and environmental law. And before joining Columbia University Law School faculty, Professor Gerrard also practiced in New York as a lawyer. And most recently, he was a partner in charge of the New York office of Arnold & Porter, where he remains senior counsel today. So he has also chaired the American Bar Association section of Environment, Energy and Resources and the New York City Bar Association's Executive Committee and the New York State Bar Association Environmental Law section. The essence of the story is that Professor Gerrard is pioneering cutting-edge legal tools to address climate change. So let's get started with the interview after this introduction. You have recently been working on two very interesting but complex topics. The first one is geoengineering, and the second one is threatened nation islands. We will start from the first one. What is geoengineering?
So climate engineering or geoengineering refers to the intentional large-scale manipulation of the Earth's climate. We're really talking about three different things here. Carbon capture and sequestration is the term usually used for putting devices on an industrial facility like a power plant or a factory to prevent the carbon dioxide from escaping into the atmosphere. That's not really geoengineering. Capturing the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, from the ambient air, is geoengineering, carbon dioxide removal. And we do not yet have it at scale. All of the projections for how we meet our temperature targets suggest we need to do an enormous amount of removal of carbon dioxide from the ambient air. We've already put too much in the atmosphere. We need to remove a great deal of it. The technology is still being developed. It is right now extremely expensive and would be slow acting. But there are quite a few technologies that are being experimented with to see if it'll work. It has relatively few risks involved, unless it's a technique that uses a lot of land or is done in the ocean. So special precautions need to be done for that. Solar radiation management is much different. Solar radiation management is a last resort. It's very scary. We're not sure if it would work. We're not sure what the side effects would be. We think that the likely technology would be to have a fleet of airplanes that are flying around all the time, releasing aerosols or something into the upper atmosphere. Almost no one hopes that we actually do it, but there's a decent chance someone is going to try it. And for that reason, it's important to have some understanding of whether it would work, what its side effects would be, and to have some system of governance so that we can know who should be able to do it and who not.
Which legislation is already existing, to deal with this, to deal with these new technologies? And what legislation is actually needed? I know you have been working on this, so we would love to know more about it.
We actually don't have any legislation on those. On carbon dioxide removal, there are some tax credits that are available, but nothing that would require government permission. But that's not so bad because the particular activities are at a small scale and are not likely to have any negative effects, except, again, when we get into the oceans, and then we may need some revisions to some of the international treaties on oceans. With respect to solar radiation management, there's really nothing. It's not governed at all, and the cost of it is low enough that a small country or even a very rich individual could undertake it, and it would not be illegal, which is a real problem. And that's why I think there should be international agreements on solar radiation management, since it's something that would have a global impact. And it also has the potential for causing global conflict. If some countries want it and some countries don't, we should have some mechanism to determine the legitimacy of particular activities.
And is there already any evaluation of like who could be the losers or who could be the winners from, for example, solar radiation management? So could it impact like any specific group? So it's scarming like solar radiation, so less heat should reach the ground. Do we expect like some specific interest groups dealing with it?
There is concern that it could affect global weather patterns in ways that are not completely predictable, that it might affect the monsoons, it might affect drought and so forth. We don't know. What we do know is that the climate change that is happening is having terrible global impacts. And so in thinking about the question, it's not only might solar radiation management have negative impacts, which is very important, but also could it counter the enormously negative impacts we know are already happening as a result of climate change?
Many of the leading groups in the sector, in particular in carbon capture and storage technologies, seem to be connected to multinational oil companies. So we have some examples. We have Shell that owns Quest Carbon Capture and Storage. We have ExxonMobil that has a joint development agreement with Global Thermostat, for example. So we never know, like the idea is that oil companies are going to try to maximize their profit. And it might make sense that in a world where we're going toward green technologies, oil companies want to participate in developing green technologies because it's a new market, is a market with little competition, and there is a lot of funding needed. And oil companies do have funding. So this is on one side. And though we know also that the big American giants in oil multinationals, Chevron and ExxonMobil, are not only investing in carbon capture, but they are also doubling down on drilling on carbon and on oil. Carbon capture and storage technologies do not directly hurt oil companies. Instead, funding for renewables increase competition, so it is a problem for oil companies. And more regulation also on carbon dioxide production hurts oil companies. So do we need to concern about the fact that multinational oil companies might be trying to invest in these technologies just to pretend that they are trying to behave green and to try to do business as usual? And together with this, I would like to know, is there any legal instrument that should try to bring the investments and the research in these technologies in the right direction? One of your books, Global Climate Change and the US Law, I went through it, and something you tell us in this book is that the oldest and most developed body of US law related to climate change concerns federal policies and programs for scientific research. So in this case, do federal funding for scientific research in these technologies could have an important role?
Well, there's a lot in there.
Yes.
There is now a great deal more public funding for carbon capture research than there used to be. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Act of 2001 and the Inflation Reduction Act of 2002 and the CHIPS Act of 2002 all have considerable federal money for that kind of research. You're certainly right that the oil companies are spending a lot on that. Many of the technologies that would be used are technologies related to what the oil companies have expertise in, storing gases underground, pipeline infrastructure, and so forth. There's no question that more oil drilling and gas development is a negative for climate change. The International Energy Agency has said that in order to meet our temperature targets, we don't need any more oil and gas exploration, but billions of dollars are being spent on that. I'm not as troubled by the the research being done by these companies, as long as it doesn't affect policy in a negative way. Carbon capture and sequestration and carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation management should absolutely not be seen as substitutes for moving away from fossil fuels and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That has to be our top priority. But under all scenarios, we're going to need a lot of carbon capture and sequestration, and we're going to need a lot of carbon dioxide removal. Solar radiation management, I hope not. But we do need a lot of these technologies, and the fact that the oil companies are putting a lot of money into it is not troubling me, again, as long as they are not affecting the underlying policies.
So after decades of gridlock, Biden finally managed to sign a useful agreement for climate change, useful policies, the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, and it incentivized clean energy, electric cars, electric homes, and invest in green technologies to ramp up manufacturing. However, the Inflation Reduction Act comes from a very complex compromise. As we saw, for example, with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the policies that we are doing right now are not going to help us be on track with curbing climate change. So we need faster-paced policies. What are the policies that we are going to see most likely be passed in Congress and Senate? What is going to be of the carbon tax that has been discussed so much?
So the Inflation Reduction Act was a major step in the right direction. It makes hundreds of billions of dollars available for clean energy. It won't get us all the way to where we need to be with our greenhouse gas reduction goals, but it gets us much of the way there. And there will be challenges in implementing it. It does include a portion of a carbon tax. It includes a fee on methane emissions, which I think is going to be very significant. It does not have a fee on carbon dioxide. There are many things that the Biden administration can do and is doing under existing laws without the need for more action by Congress on controlling emissions from motor vehicles, which are now the largest single source of emissions in the U.S., controlling emissions from coal-fired power plants, which are the second largest, and various other things. So the Biden administration is doing a great deal. In terms of what else Congress might do, there are only two things that I think might plausibly happen in this Congress with the split control. There's a lot of discussion about permit reform, about speeding up the permitting of facilities, and the big issue there is the Democrats want to speed up the approval of renewables, and the Republicans want to speed up the permitting of fossil facilities, and coming up with some kind of compromise is challenging, but there are a lot of discussions of that. But there may be legislation on that. There may also be legislation on a carbon border adjustment, on imposing a fee on the importation of items like steel and cement, whose manufacture generated a lot of greenhouse gases. Europe is heading in the direction of that. The U.S. might as well. I don't see other legislation coming out of this Congress. And what happens in the next Congress after the 2024 election will obviously depend on who's in control of the House and the Senate and the White House. And nobody knows that yet. But I think we are making significant progress. Let me just say, I don't agree with the thought that the Inflation Reduction Act has negatives in that it is impeding other legislation. I think that act was absolutely as far as we could go with this Congress. And that's one reason why electoral action is so important, that it really, really matters who wins elections.
Yes, and I hope is that also by seeing the positive effects of the Inflation Reduction Act, maybe it could also convince more people about the importance of curbing climate change. We see what is the effects.
That's right. And it's also going to create a very large number of jobs. We're going to have literally millions of jobs in clean energy, in building the wind and the solar and the transmission and everything else. And that hopefully will have a political effect when people see how many jobs are created by this.
Exactly. With some increasing then interest also in passing these kind of policies. The Environmental Policy Agency is telling us that global sea level has risen by 8 inches since 1870s. It doesn't seem much when you say it like that, but it's actually threatening some nation islands, in particular in the Pacific and in the Indian Ocean. So what are some examples of these nation islands? Are the Marshall Islands, Kiribati, Tuvalu, and the Maldives, for example. And this situation opens up to some important and scary questions. So if a nation completely goes underwater, because that's what could happen with these islands, is it still a nation? And does the nation still have a seat, for example, at the UN? And what about the inhabitants of those islands? They're going to be displaced. Are they going to be citizens of some nation? What is going to happen with them?
Well, the short answer is we don't know for sure because that's never happened. But there's an international agreement called the Montevideo Convention, which set forth the basic rules on what you need to be in order to be a state. You need to have a permanent population. You need to have defined territory. You need to have a government, and you need to have the ability to have relations with other countries. So as long as you have some population living in a place, and it has to be a permanent population, not lighthouse keepers, not visitors. If you have a permanent population there and a self-government on land, you're still a state. So it's probably going to be a very long time before any of these atoll nations are completely uninhabitable. If that were to happen, there's no procedure in the UN Charter to expel a state. No state has ever been expelled. It would probably require a vote of the United Nations General Assembly upon a recommendation of the National Security Council. There is now some active discussion of trying to get international agreement in advance that a state is perpetual. There are international doctrines for that, but if there were an international agreement that a state will never cease to be a state, even if its people have been dispersed, I think that would be a step in the right direction. But it's not a matter of urgency because it'll be decades at least before any of these countries are completely uninhabitable. As to the citizenship of the people who are displaced, that will be the choice of the countries where they go. The international community cannot readily say that certain countries have to give citizenship to people from other countries. There are international norms on letting them in and treating them humanely, which not every country follows. There's some discussion of having continued citizenship in a country that is underwater. Hopefully it would be dual citizenship, so there's a meaningful passport and so forth. All this is the subject of a lot of quiet behind-the-scenes discussions these days, but we don't have a clear resolution to it.
So we saw that in the US there have been a lot of natural disasters, between the worst. We remember, for example, Hurricane Katrina and Maria. And the idea is that also New York was hit by a hurricane, so Sandy. And I would like to know from you that should we expect a situation like the day after tomorrow in New York? So how does local and state level can prevent or take care of these natural disasters that are going to come and hit the city much more than before?
Well, I don't think the scenario in the movie The Day After Tomorrow was going to happen where you had this very rapidly moving ice sheet. But very bad things can happen. Hurricane Sandy happened when Michael Bloomberg was the mayor, and he set up a very important program to try to anticipate what may happen with climate change in New York City and to prepare for it. And so there have been quite a few changes, for instance, to building codes to require new buildings on the shoreline to be protected from flooding and so forth. There is now what is in essence a seawall that is being constructed around the Lower East Side of Manhattan and will in a form wrap around the lower tip, which is where the financial district, where Wall Street is located, to protect them. Of course, that's where the money is, so it's not surprising where a lot of the resources are going to protecting that. The Army Corps of Engineers has an important study to try to decide how to protect the New York, New Jersey region from extreme flooding, and they have a proposal that involves some sea gates, not as large as those we see in Venice, but some sea gates, and also a lot of sea walls around the coastline. Those are going to be very controversial. So many studies are being done. Serious examination is being done. I don't know how it'll turn out. The threat of sea level rise is very serious for New York and for every coastal city in the world. Some cities are even more vulnerable than New York. New Orleans is a prime example. And society is not yet fully grappling with those issues to the extent that it needs to, but we are seeing serious discussions and some serious money in some places.
So, I would like to ask you a more personal question. And we know that before joining the Columbia faculty at the law school department, you were working as a lawyer. And also now you're doing some side works, maybe. You were in particular a lawyer at Arnold and Porter, and you served as a partner in charge of the New York City office and worked on environmental practices already. So it is a long history on environmental policy and regulation and law. And we would like to know first that, like, how is your experience different as a lawyer and as a professor working on the same topic?
Well, of course, if you're a lawyer at a law firm, you're representing clients, and your job is to help the clients solve their problems. And it's very interesting, challenging work. You have less choice in what you work on than in academia. In academia, we have the luxury of being able to choose what issues we want to do, what positions we want to take, what we want to write about. So many of the similar skills are involved in both settings, but there are different forces at work in a law firm versus in a law school.
Okay, yes, I can see it. And that I think that maybe like also this position as a professor and as a researcher give you more like freedom and time also to work on this cutting edge kind of legislation. So for example, to try to understand and develop something that is not there yet. I guess it is easier to do it from the academia than
certainly. As a lawyer in a law firm, you're generally charging not only by the hour, but by the sixth of an hour. So you have to keep track of everything you do, and you want to make sure that you are working enough hours and so forth. It's a completely different situation in academia.
And so we're reaching the end of the interview, and I would like to ask two final questions. The first one regards the fact that you have founded and you are the faculty director of the Sabin Center for Climate Change, and so the center develops legal tools to fight climate change, trains law students, and to train lawyers. It also provides to the public some useful instruments such as the Inflation Reduction Act tracker and the regulation tracker. I've been on the website, as you can see, and it seems very interesting, both for specialists, but also for maybe people in other departments and other researchers, but even for the general public. So, can you tell us a little bit of how the center started? Well, like, how did the idea happen and how did it develop? What are the useful tools in it? And what are the possibilities as well for students to collaborate with the center and help out with it or learn from it?
So in 2008, I was still practicing law, and I was approached by the dean of Columbia Law School asking if I was interested in talking to them about joining the faculty to teach environmental law. And after a lot of thought, I called the dean back and said, how about if I join the faculty to teach environmental law and also start up a center on climate change law? My first book on the subject, Global Climate Change in U.S. Law, the first edition had just been published. I had become extremely concerned about the issue of climate change. So I started it up when I joined the faculty in 2009. We've been fortunate to have some generous donors and also project work. So we now have 11 full-time lawyers and are active internationally, nationally, and locally. Our best known public resource is our climate litigation database, which keeps track of all the climate change lawsuits around the world. So far, we've counted about 2,200 of them, of which about 70% are from the United States. We have summer interns who both law students and graduate students and undergraduates from Columbia. I have research assistants and teaching assistants. We sometimes bring in other people. We put on a lot of public events and events for the student body, the university community. We have a free mailing list, several free mailing lists. You go on our website, just Google Sabin Center for Climate Change Law, you'll find it. And we would love for people to follow our activities.
Perfect, exactly. I have visited the website and I would strongly suggest it as well. So I wanted to bring it up. And so your very, very last question is going to be very personal. And we're asking it during every interview. And the idea is, what is your sliding door moment? So what is the moment you decided to work on climate in particular, and how did it happen?
Well, let me say, I decided to become an environmental lawyer largely because I grew up in Charleston, West Virginia, which is a town dominated by the petrochemical industry. So it has a lot of air pollution and water pollution, and that's what sparked my interest in going into the environmental field. And so I decided to go to law school so that I could become an environmental lawyer. My interest in climate change really took off in the early 2000s, just as I was reading more and more about the emerging science. And I wouldn't say there was any one moment, but I decided that my next book, I'd already done several books by then, but my next book would be on climate change. And that was the book, Global Climate Change in U.S. Law. And doing all the research and work on that really made me extremely concerned and convinced me that since I had some expertise in the area, that I should really devote my time to that issue more than any other, and that's what I've been doing since and expect to do for the balance of my career.
So thank you very much, Professor Michael Gerrard, and thank you, everybody. This was our third episode of Espresso with the Experts. We'll see each other in the next episodes. Meanwhile, follow us on Instagram. You can find the episode also on Spotify, YouTube, and on our website.